Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our panel today, Indigenous Pathways to a Regenerative Future. And I'm Alexis Bunten. I co-direct the Indigeneity program along with my partner, Cara Romero. Oh, thank you. And I am Alaska Native, Unangan, and Yupik, and also Swedish American. I currently live in Monterey, California. I moved south some years ago. And I've personally been thinking about these issues of indigeneity and capitalism for well over 20 years. And I've written a few books and several articles on the topic. And so I'm very excited about this topic. And one of the things about this topic is that Indigenous peoples have been and still are the leaders in stewarding the environment. I think most of you know that. And thinking about that and some of the terms I've come to learn as I've joined the Bioneers family and networks of networks, I've come to learn the term regenerative, which is in the title of this panel. And when I first heard it, I thought it was the weirdest term because it was something that is inherent to Indigenous worldviews. And I felt the same way when I came to learn of the term permaculture. And I felt like these terms were really ways of anglicizing Indigenous concepts without actually always acknowledging where these concepts come from. Or perhaps it is the dominant settler society coming to figure out on their own something that we've known all along. But at the end of the day, we all need to work together across cultural divides, racial and class divides, to make the planet the better place and solve our environmental crises. So today, that's what we're going to do. We're going to talk about dominant economic systems and how they can be transformed through Indigenous-led solutions and campaigns and the actions that you can take to help be a part of that transformation. And we also, and all the other things we can do, also through things like philanthropy and investing capital into Native communities, because we tend to come up with what's considered to be out of the box, very innovative ideas and ways of solving things, but they're out of the box and innovative compared to the dominant society. And we don't think that way, which is our advantage. So with that, I'm going to start in introducing our panelists. We have Nick Estes. And I'll keep the introductions very, very brief because you can go to the website or the app or Google them and see their bios and lots more about them. Nick is Lower Brule Sioux. He is enrolled in the Lower Brule Sioux Tribe, and he is transitioning to be a professor at University of Minnesota. And he helped to found the Oak Lake Writers. He co-founded an organization called Red Nation, which is about liberating Native people from capitalism and colonialism. And he's also founding Red Media, which is an organization to amplify Indigenous voices, particularly around publishing. And if you heard me this morning, I'm super excited to finally publish with an Indigenous publisher. And he's also the author of Our History is Our Future, Standing Rock versus the Dakota Access Pipeline, and the Long Tradition of Indigenous Resistance. And then to the other side of Nick is Sikowis, and she is Plains Cree, Saulteaux, and Gordon First Nation, north of the Medicine Line. That's where her family's from. She is the founder of Great Plains Action Society, which is a collection of Indigenous organizers in the Great Plains area working to resist and indigenize colonial institutions, ideologies, and behaviors. She's also a prolific writer, and if you Google her writings, between the two of these speakers, they have all the badassery that I like to read in order to fix things in this planet. So with that, let's get started. And we're going to go right into the meat of the subject. And I'm going to direct it to you first, Sikowis. So the first question is, why do you call capitalism Christian colonial capitalism?
I call it that because we have a white Christian problem. I call it that because it's the truth of what we are facing right now in terms of the issues that capitalism has created, for us. the climate crisis, social injustice, all the things we face essentially stem from capitalism. But where does capitalism come from, right? Capitalism is something that's deeply tied to the process of colonization, and the idea that God gave man dominion over the earth, the dogma, that men, in particular, have a right to do whatever they want to do with our earth and with this every other living species on it, including women. And so, I don't feel like you're doing it justice by calling it just capitalism, because the type of capitalism that we are dealing with is very historically entrenched in Christianity and colonization, and has given rise to consumerism on top of that. I like to think of it as the 4 C's, because of that now, I'm just thinking about like how we're facing a really huge, obvious rise in fascism at the moment. Though as an Indigenous person, I would argue that we've been facing fascism. It's been here, right? But that it's become mainstream. It's since Trump was voted in. Not that it really changed necessarily people's sentiments, but it made people more comfortable with being vocal about it and practicing, fascism. And so, I just want to state, like, the last presidency, the last administration, which is having a huge effect on us right now because of, for instance, the Supreme Court, right, was 95% white, 98.9% Christian, 90% men, right? Like, that was the Republican administration in the last, run. And, 53% of the women that voted for Trump were evangelicals. And I know that, this is, and this conversation isn't had that much in terms of when we talk about economies, right? It's not really discussed that, like, Christianity is actually like the underpinning or the foundation of like what's happening right now with the world and how we do things. And maybe I'm biased because I have a master's degree in religious studies, but I truly do believe that conversation needs to be had. A great example of something right now that's happening, like a very succinct example of how that particular economy and that type of thinking is affecting us is, of course, with this draft decision on abortion. And, I'm just Alito, and I'm going to thank Lawrence Rosenthal yesterday for bringing this up in his panel, who mentioned that Alito said, "This nation's history and tradition is at odds with abortion rights." I mean, that right there gives you a very good example of like how Christianity basically runs the show, and it runs our economy, and you cannot say it without, talking about capitalism.
So I guess where I would fall in that particular conversation is thinking about how colonial Christian capitalism is really speaking about the 3 things of imperialism, which is God, gold, and glory. Of course, there's this saying that says when Christians came, they had the Bible and Indians had the land. Now we have the Bible and the Christians have the land. Well, they still have the Bible and the land, but in this particular case. But I also think that the question of capitalism is also central in how we understand wealth, because when the so-called United States declared its independence from Great Britain, 3/4 of the wealth that it held were in 2 things: human beings and land, right? The enslavement of African people and the taking of indigenous land through speculation. It's no wonder that somebody like George Washington was the most successful land speculator at that particular moment in time, and some would argue that he was trying to recoup his losses, and so that's partly why he declared independence from the Great Britain, or the monarchy. And by 1830, the United States had the largest GDP of any developed nation. It was the first nation born entirely as a capitalist nation. Those are facts, right? The United States didn't become an empire during the Spanish Civil War at the turn of the century. The United States was fundamentally an expansionist project from the very beginning. The acquisition of territory, the annexation of territory is fundamentally the definition of imperialism. So from the get-go, this country was founded on that aspect. And they've used the justification. Speaking of the Supreme Court, we can go to the Marshall Trilogy. If you're familiar with that, has become the kind of basis of Indian law as we know it now. And it basically argues, Justice John Marshall argued that the taking of indigenous lands was just because indigenous people didn't possess the full rights of human beings, didn't possess the full rights of Christian nations, according to the doctrine of discovery, a 15th century papal bull that was issued that essentially justified not only the colonization of the Americas, but the enslavement of African people. So I think that's important to point out, that capitalism isn't just a kind of blind economic system that creates ideologies. Sure, it does, but it's also justified by certain ideologies. And one could argue that it's justified by a very kind of theological, or I would call it a theofascist argument about Christian supremacy. So I think when we think about that in terms of the recent uprisings that have taken place in the United States just in the past decade, it's no wonder that the most violent reactions come when you try to take down a Confederate flag, or come when you try to take down the statue of a colonizer such as Christopher Columbus, because the soft underbelly of the system has always been glory. How do you glorify the conquest and genocide and enslavement of entire continents and peoples? And so I think, what Sikowis posits as Christian colonial capitalism is fundamentally correct, but it also helps us understand kind of the very weakness of that system as much as we understand its functioning.
Wow. I just want to kind of riff off what I heard both of you say. And one thing that comes to mind for me is, what would Jesus do? WWJD. Because if you have read the New Testament, you know that Jesus would do none of this. He was about supporting the weak, the most feeble, the most in need, the most maligned in society, and sharing with everybody. So what happened, and I won't get too much into it, is as Christianity began to rise in power and the Catholic Church began to amass wealth and land, and they became imbricated with the feudal lords, kings and queens across Europe as it spread. And they worked in cahoots to amass more power. And the original meaning of what Jesus meant got lost through all that. So then, as proto-capitalism began to develop and systems of land tenure and ownership began taken over by kings and queens and feudal lords, no longer held in commune by the people that worked the land, they began to accumulate far more wealth, and that wealth and power, through accumulating that wealth and power, they needed more resources to extract as capitalism began to develop. And in that, we had the need to what they call the Age of Discovery, which brought in colonial empires and the way to subjugate the people that they met. As Nick said, first it was justified ideologically by these papal bulls, saying that if you're not Christian, if you're a heathen, you're not human. It was a form of dehumanizing, so that millions of people could be killed, displaced, enslaved, because they're not human. But also the coming in, like you said, coming in with the Bible to Christianize and missionize people, and we're still trying to recover from that today. So that's just kind of a thought I had, but one thing I wanted to add to this before I go to the next question is that I have a theory that there could be different kinds of capitalism. So in the Western sense of capitalism, you have to have three things for a capitalist mode of production. So that's wage labor and exploitation, private ownership of the means of production, and industrial technology in order to extract more labor and make more things so that the money can circulate, so that it can accumulate more in the hands of the wealthy. And I really did a lot of thinking about that because I've looked at our tribal economies, how we handle capitalism today, and really tried to think, because one of the deepest stereotypes about Indigenous peoples is that our traditional societies are like socialist. It doesn't even fit into that, into that kind of thinking. But I was thinking about that, and did many tribes I know have wage labor? No, not really, but there was exploitation of labor. There was slavery among many different tribes. What about private ownership of land and resources? Well, of course, there was no private ownership of land. However, among many tribal societies, there were cases where different clans or different groups of society, there were hierarchies who had exclusive first rights to places with certain resources, like hunting and fishing grounds or places where you would rotate your crops. So, sort of. And then industrial technology, certainly Indigenous peoples, especially many of the tribes in what is now called Mexico, had great technologies, very many great technologies, but these technologies were not used in the process of creating more capital that could be further accumulated. So I kind of tend to think that, and I've written an article about it called Indigenous Capitalisms, and I think that the way many of our tribes work within the existing system is by drawing upon our core values that have been passed down through generations to adjust the way capitalism is done today, to create new paths forward. And for example, my own Alaska Native Corporation, we've always had a motto that every business decision we make, every portfolio decision we make is based on our motto, which is fish first, because we live in the greatest sockeye salmon fishery in the world, and everything revolves around fish. It's always fish first. And that's really helped our corporation to make some great decisions that makes it one of the top 10 businesses in Alaska. And it's not business as usual, it's business is better, because that type of capitalism is guided by our values. So I'm going to give you, either of you, a couple minutes if you want to respond to what I just said, and then I'll transition to the next question.
Sure. I guess I'll take it, then pass it over to Sikowis. And I guess I would just say that I think it is wrong to say that Indigenous people prior to colonization were somehow socialists. I mean, socialism, the word, arose at a time specifically with labor militancy and certain revolutions in Western Europe, but didn't really take hold until the peripheries, and we had like the Russian Revolution, which wasn't even really considered part of Europe, as well as former colonized countries like trying to move away from capitalism. And I always think about the theorist Amilcar Cabral. He was an African theorist and revolutionary. He was waging an actual guerrilla war against the Portuguese colonists in Guinea-Bissau, and he came up with this idea called return to the source. And what he meant by that is that capitalist logic tends to say that all societies, human societies, are universal, meaning that they all kind of tend towards capitalism. And he was saying that, in fact, what has happened in the case of Africa is that Africa has been purposefully knocked off its natural path towards development because of European colonization and the slave trade and the looting of African resources. Why is it that there's a cobalt mine in Congo or a diamond mine in Congo, but the children mining the very things that we use in our cell phones can't even read the contracts, that are being signed by their governments and these multinational corporations. And so his idea was that you identify the most revolutionary aspect of your society, and in this case, not all African people had identified with an indigenous or tribal identity, but he found that indigenous or tribal people who were less impacted by Portuguese colonialism had kind of the source of anti-colonialism and provided the most fierce resistance to the Portuguese colonizers. And through training and developing them, in guerrilla warfare as well as literacy campaigns, they were able to defeat Portuguese colonialism. And why I'm telling this story and what this has to do with the question that Alexis has posed to us is to say that I don't believe Indigenous people were, communist, or what do they say, primitive communism, so much as they were non-capitalist. And the value systems that we've created, whether our language, et cetera, some of them, not all of them, had a view of the world that wasn't exploitative, that was tending towards, at least in a Lakota worldview, tending towards correct relations, or at least aspiring to, at the very least. Because the primary mode of production, how one got their food, wasn't based on ever expansive growth and exploitation. And that's fundamentally different than what was introduced before. And when we think about capitalism, we also have to talk about class. Class isn't just about your income. Class is about power. It's fundamentally about power. And I think Indigenous people are often removed from that question. And the genocide, the massive genocide of Indigenous people within this hemisphere, one of the largest genocide in human history that we know of, was a form of class warfare that not only destroyed entire nations of people, but destroyed entire alternative histories and possibilities of this particular land. And so we've been knocked off our course of development, and I think it's appropriate to not only challenge capitalism, but also move through it and work towards a different kind of system, and to understand that the culture and the values and the languages and the practices we still retain, the remnants of that, can be the basis of a new system and should be the basis of a new system. I think of Black Elk saying, they cut down the tree of life, but the roots still remain. Like, Indigenous lifeways are the roots of this land. And we can see successful anti-capitalist, socialistic movements being led by Indigenous people in this hemisphere that have been successful. We wouldn't have the conversation of the rights of nature movement had it not been for the movement towards socialism, which was led by Indigenous peasants and campesinos and miners in Bolivia. It's not to say that they've transcended capitalism. They still exploit nature in the same way that capitalist systems do, but they have an alternative project in the works. So it's a complicated situation, and I think in the North we have a lot to learn from those particular movements. And it's not to say that there's one solution. I think there's a difference between monopoly capital on the scale of like Amazon or big tech, like even somebody like Elon Musk, and having tribally owned fisheries. There's a fundamental difference between those two projects. And I think we should look at the big capitalists, such as Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos, as a real enemy of the planet, versus trying to think about small-scale projects that are just trying to give jobs to people. There's a big difference between that. And I don't think that kind of transition should fall on the backs of Indigenous people so much as it should fall on the pocketbooks of these billionaires who, in my opinion, shouldn't exist in the first place.
I've been thinking about a quote by Piao Piao Mox Mox that I like to give when talking about Indigenous economies and when I'm railing against capitalism. And he said he was one of the chiefs of the Walla Walla, and in 1855 he said, "Goods on the earth are not equal. Goods are for using on the earth. I do not know where they have given land for goods." And basically, what he was saying is we don't really sell land, right? Like, we use it, and we use the goods on it, but like, what's this idea about selling land? I'm not saying that, there weren't Indigenous people out there that maybe didn't sell land, but that sentiment, I think, is something that needs to be looked into a lot more. I don't like to use the term socialism or capitalism or any of the isms concerning economies when discussing Indigenous economies, because they're not the right terms. Those are Western terms that are being applied to Indigenous ways of being. And so they are, in a sense, then, again, mangling what was, But yet, what is there? What did we have? Unfortunately, we don't really know. We'll never know like exactly what was happening, right? Because so much has been lost. But like Nick said, we have the roots, right? There needs to be much more conversation surrounding this to get to Indigenous-led regenerative economies. There needs to be, think tanks, if you will, more than just Indigenous studies. There needs to be, Indigenous economies, institutions that like are really focused on this, because Indigenous people will save the world. And I believe that because the reason we were genocided so heavily across the world, the reason only 3% of Indigenous people are protecting 80% of the world's biodiversity right now, is because Christians didn't like what we had to say. They didn't like how we lived. It bothered them, it scared them, it affected them very deeply. And so that's what we right there. That goes to show you that's what we need to do then. That's the direction we need to go in. We need to revive that. And that it is being done. I'm so proud to see so many nations across Turtle Island, across the world, reviving traditional practices, reviving their economies. But it is falling very short because we are forever being crushed under the weight of actors like, Elon Musk, as an example. The greater capitalism, the greater capitalistic economy is winning, right? And not winning in the sense that we're all going to be better off for it, winning in the sense that we will all be dead for it. And, that's, I'm not exaggerating. We're heading in a very scary direction. It is the cause of the climate emergency. It is the cause of so much suffering and injustice in the world right now. And, this basic fundamental understanding, this tiny little thought that the earth is your mother, if you can change that switch, if you can switch that, if you make that switch go in your head from thinking of the earth as something you can just consistently take from to something you want to protect and keep healthy, that can change how you do business. And it's so simple to say it, and I feel very simplistic when I say it, but yet it's like I live by that. It's how I try to decolonize my mind, I guess. It's I don't even know if you can really decolonize these systems, right? I think we just need to take them down. So,
Come on,
that's where I'm at. And bring in an Indigenous-led regenerative economy.
Well, now that we've kind of unpacked the problem a bit, I would like to transition to what are some of the ways that we can hand over the power and the capital to Native leaders, communities, entrepreneurs, for those who want to be in this system or create an Indigenous capitalism, and some of the key ways to do that are through philanthropy and investing capital into Native communities. So I'd like to pose the questions to you about what can philanthropy and investing capital, impact investing, what can it do to rectify these structural problems that you two unpacked so well?
I'll go first because I can set like a tone for what we're dealing with.
Sure.
So First Nations Development Institute did a study between 2006 and 2014, and they found that foundations gave only 0.6%, or out of all foundation funding, only 0.6% was given to Indigenous-led initiatives, organizations, what have you. And this is outside of tribal giving. And that's important, though, because 70% of Natives live off of reservations now. And white-led orgs are exploiting that still. The funds of a lot of these funds are still going to white-led organizations that are working on Indigenous issues. There's just so much paternalism, it's ridiculous. Basically, and this is just the blunt way to say it, I think that the typical colonizer descendant thinks we're stupid. And that we can't handle ourselves, that we can't fix our problems. And that is not a sentiment that is something from the past. Like, it's still here till this day. You know what I'm talking about, like a white woman coming into our communities and teaching our children how to bathe, teaching us how to do, whatever. Just live. Because they wanted us to do it in their fashion. And so that sentiment still runs very deeply in the funding world. And that's one of the reasons why we're not further ahead when we really should be, because we're pretty badass. I always say that Indigenous women are the walking embodiment of a social impact investment. You give Indigenous women funding to do something, and it's going to be amazing. Drawdown tells us that. They did a study on 100 ways to, address the climate crisis, and I think 3 or 4 of their top 100 ways to fix this issue are to give women money. And Indigenous women in particular, right? Why, why Indigenous women? Well, because they're going to use it to bring back, traditional ecological knowledge, to pass it on to their children, and to bring up a new wave of a generation that is going to do better. And the other thing I wanted to mention is we don't have how you are truly sovereign. You are a truly sovereign people when you can feed yourself. I mean, that to me is like the #1 indicator for real sovereignty, right? But instead, we are still domestic dependent nations living in food deserts and, really, really suffering from high rates of diabetes and obesity because we're just not eating right. But, I want to see funders. I want to see whoever these people are, philanthropists, investors. I want to see them invest in proper food systems. Food systems are, in the US, are deplorable, and I won't talk too much about Iowa because that's where I'm from, and I can go really, really deep into that. But that's ground zero for big ag. And so we see right there what's going on, and then that's also what's happening on our reservations with the checkerboarding and the insidious nature of big ag coming in and taking our land and not doing what should be done on it. So it's not something talked about enough in the philanthropy world, in the Indigenous world, even the organizations, the tribal nations are doing some great things, right? Like they've got food, first food initiatives, they had food sovereignty initiatives, but it's just not enough. Like, we really need to rematriate massive swaths of land in order to decarbonize, in order to grow healthy food, and it needs to be Indigenous-led, and funders need to support that work, because that's really what's going to help us with climate and social injustice.
I think of this as like a historical and a structural question. Andrew Carnegie wrote the classic book, The Gospel of Wealth. Sorry, y'all are gonna go to sleep on me pretty soon.
We've
Pull
all
out your
read it.
pillows, nap time, history lesson. No, he wrote this book called The Gospel of Wealth, and I read it once. I don't know why I read it. Don't ask me why I read it. But I read it once, and one of the chapters he begins talking about how he went out at the turn of the century when most of the remaining kind of people who were once free, including my people, were put onto reservations and essentially turned into prisoner of war camps. And he went and visited an unnamed Lakota leader, what he called a chief, and he went into this man's home and he saw that this man lived exactly like every other single person in his tribe, had the exact same material possessions. And Andrew Carnegie was kind of appalled by it because he was like, this is why equality doesn't work. And it's because for him, equality would mean oppression or would feel like oppression. And I thought that was a really interesting, he obviously didn't draw that lesson from it, but that was the lesson I drew from it. It was like, this man is showing you through his humility and his humbleness that he's just as poor as the poorest person in his society, and therefore he's a leader. And Andrew Carnegie, of course, was like, oh, but then he becomes this kind of prophet of philanthropy, et cetera, et cetera. And my question on one hand is, well, why didn't you just pay your taxes, first of all? Why did you have to exploit so many people? And then why did you have to hide all your money in a non-taxable foundation? Now everyone who's going to fund my project is now no longer going to fund my project after saying this. Because I can't pitch a project to you to say, well, actually the reason why there's scarcity in Indian country is because billionaires aren't paying taxes. The wealthy aren't paying their fair share of taxes, and there's a governing ideology in this country that Native people get handouts from the government. I was just having a conversation with the wonderful Frank Bibo, who was speaking on the Rights of Nature panel earlier, and we were talking about, how fundamentally, there's an imposed scarcity and an imposed lack of imagination within tribal communities, because our livelihoods are dictated by a system that was never meant to succeed. And so when we talk about scarcity, when we talk about wealth and all of these things, it's because historically the institutions of healthcare, education have been historically underfunded. There was a report that just came out through the Department of Interior, which is fascinating because the Department of Interior just basically gave the documentation over that its offices committed genocide, systemic genocide for a century and a half by putting tens of thousands of children through the boarding school system, many of them not returning, but then basically taking the wealth from the land and the resources that were sold on behalf of Indigenous people and using it to steal those children and send them back to those systems. And then on top of that, using those children as hostages, the language that they use to get their parents to sell the land. And then mismanaging $176 billion of individual Indian money accounts over the course of a century. This was found through a forensic audit by the late Blackfeet accountant, Eloise Cobell. If you don't know who that is, you should look that person up. And she led a class action lawsuit against the federal government, and the United States government paid $3.5 billion, pennies on the dollar, of what we were owed for all the wealth that they stole from us through royalties, through the mismanagement of our funds. That's just what they could count. And we're talking tens of millions of pages of documents, tens of thousands of documents that have been stored away in archives, and all to take the land. Not just to take the land, but to build the wealth of this country. And a quarter of Americans, white Americans alive today, are direct descendants of people who benefited from land systems such as the Homestead Act. You have inbuilt intergenerational wealth in your family. Not every Native people were categorically denied, obviously it was our land, but so too were Black families, and so too were many immigrant families that came to this country. And so when we talk about inequality and reinvesting, we have to begin with how essentially the system is set up for the enrichment of a very few. And I think we should think about the things that Sikowis was talking about in reinvesting. I'm not really in the philanthropy world, so I can't really offer anything. But I would really encourage those Native organizations and those community organizations that are seeking funding to also look at membership models, because the Red Nation is mostly majority funded by a membership model where we have people pay into the system. It's kind of like a union. And so we're autonomous. We don't need to cry on the shoulder of the white man who stole our land for funding, even though they're morally obligated, in my opinion, to hand over that wealth. And I think it would have been justice on behalf of Eloise Cobell's case, as well as the century and a half of genocide against Indigenous children in this country, to just hand out a check to people than keeping the land and not fundamentally changing the system. So I don't know where we go from there, but that's kind of my rant on that question.
Well, I have a few things I want to bounce off of that I heard you both say. It's interesting too. For example, Sikowis, you talked about the terms that we shouldn't use, and sorry, you said the word development. I know you know the inherent. It's okay, I always make mistakes too. But that's part of the inherent ideology and flaw that underlies capitalism and what people are brainwashed to think, that it's called a myth of progress, that everything's progressing. Everything's always getting to a better state. It's carefully tied in with social Darwinism, which says that some people and races are inherently better, smarter, good at stuff. That's what capitalist progress is too. And when you were talking about Carnegie, it made me think about, oh gosh, sometimes I like to torture myself or just know the enemy, but I recently saw a very old speech by Milton Friedman, and he said the same thing we're still hearing decades later, that, oh, the only free nations are the nations with capitalism. And I went through the little phylofacts in my head of tribes and cultures that I know, places I visited, spent time, and I thought, it's actually totally not true if you look at indigenous economic systems. And I won't name names, but the tribes that I know that had the most quote-unquote wealth and the deepest trade routes tended to be the ones that had the most hierarchies and slaves as well, whereas the ones that were what we would call in anthropology more egalitarian actually had more freedom. And there's a lot of archaeological research, current ethnographic research that shows that people in those societies have 60+% free time. Everybody. Do you have 60% free time in your week? So I don't know what this myth of freedom and this myth of progress. So let me say something practical here. I want to talk about investing capital into Indigenous communities, and I also want to echo what Sikowis said. There is a rampant stereotype that we don't know what we are doing, that you don't trust us, and you don't believe that we know the way out of the mess, that you know better than us. And it's simply not true. And right now, investing in Indigenous communities is extremely hot. There's lots of funds that are trying to support people of color. I've heard from people in the impact investing world that after George Floyd, there was a huge amount of capital that flowed into Black communities, and a lot of the people I know in those spaces are worried that it's going to go away. It's not just a fad of the moment, it needs to keep happening. And now there are people looking to fund in tribes, Indigenous entrepreneurs, and they're having a really hard time finding these people to invest in because they're not attractive to them. They expect Indigenous entrepreneurs and tribes and people that want to bring capital and help transform their communities to meet the existing system, when it's really the other way around. And that impact community, investing community, is going to learn a lot more from the way we do things. They're lucky to have us to fund in, as far as I'm concerned. And so just to say a few practical things, some of the barriers to our entrepreneurs and communities wanting to work with you all in those spaces, right off the bat, we have term sheets. Term sheets that, if you're doing equity financing, that mean that we have to scale faster than we want to, faster than trust, faster than making relationships. And then it's a sell. And then in those term sheets, you don't want to make sure that the board of directors is native in perpetuity so that the values and the direction that founded the company is going to remain. So that's why you see very few native people who are taking any equity funding. They'd rather take out loans. Now, what's the problem with loans? The problem with loans is that we're poor. We have to work triple, quadruple, so much more just to get ahead and barely have the time to build our products and our businesses and things that trickle throughout our community and create a circular economy in our communities. But yet, so Nick just talked about the riches off white supremacy and land and slavery, and so it's the people who have reaped the benefits of that, who've reaped the benefits of home ownership and the GI Bill and not having suffered from redlining, that have that equity to pass on to their kids. So how many people, if they're trying to start a business, their parents loan them money? How many, they always say, go to your friends and family round first so you can build up to MVP, most valuable or most viable product, and then you can start to look for more funding. We can't do it. We're totally excluded from that. It's a joke to tell us to start with friends and family rounds. There's new kinds of products out there. I'm really excited about revenue-based financing for Indigenous-led businesses. And yet there's very little out there, and those term sheets too are difficult. At the same point in time, there are some organizations that are working to build capital and bring them to tribes and communities, and they tell their investors, well, it's going to be a very long haul, and don't expect more than 2 to 4%, but you're investing for good. That's problematic as well. That's saying we can't get the job done. And that forwards that stereotype that we can't make money, we're going to make it the way we want to make it that's going to serve our communities first. So those are just a few thoughts if you want to invest in Native communities, Native entrepreneurs, bring capital into our communities. Just a few things to think about. And if you want to learn more about the nuts and bolts of this, go to the 4:30 panel in the Indigenous Forum, because we have Native women lead there in New Mexico Community Capital, and they're Native women-led, they're revolutionizing this whole area. So I'm going to move on to the last question before Q&A. So the question starts with a statement. So we now know that Christian colonial capitalism is the root of all social and environmental problems that we're facing. So the first part of the question is kind of lofty, and the second is a little bit more practical. So to address these problems, is it even practical to think that we can get rid of capitalism at all in our lifetimes? Or does it need to transform somehow? Is there some kind of middle way where we can learn from looking at many different cross-cultural economic systems? Another way to think about it is like, what do we need to do to dismantle the system that we're in while we're in it to lead to that transformation that may come a few generations after us? So what are some of the things that we can do right now, and can we transform it? And just a little question. And I'll send it to you first, Nick.
Look, capitalism is neither inevitable nor is it natural to human society. We can look at all the human societies that have existed throughout time, the massive diversity, immense diversity of human, culture, and understand that this is a minoritarian kind of like tendency that developed out of Western Europe that kind of spread to the rest of the planet at great peril to many people, and now at great peril to everyone because of catastrophic climate change. When we talk about the invention of the steam engine in the early 1800s, or I guess the mass proliferation of the steam engine in industrial capitalism and the mills, the textile mills in England, that was a result of hand-picked cotton by an enslaved labor force on land that was stolen from indigenous people. And so when we think about the carbon emissions, the historical carbon emissions, it's fundamentally tied to those two processes. And that was only possible because of global capitalism, something we know as imperialism. Capitalism wasn't just an isolated thing that kind of started off on a small scale and then expanded. It was fundamentally a global system when it was inaugurated. And so I think to understand it that way opens up a new set of problems, but I think a new set of solutions as well. and looking at global supply chains. We can even look at tribal nations. We can ask ourselves why a place like the Navajo Nation, which is essentially a state, in terms of its size and population, and how much resources that it holds in terms of coal, oil and gas, as well as uranium. But why is it that that nation isn't as rich as all of the, Chevrons or all of the Shell oil companies or all the energy companies that exist? It's because it's fundamentally resource colonialism. It's taking those places and purposefully impoverishing them so that they can take the raw material, develop it, and then sell it back to somebody else. We had moments in time where various kind of nationalist tribal councils in the Navajo Nation tried to essentially nationalize its oil industry and keep production within its boundaries, but that was attacked by the federal government to break that up in the interest of these energy corporations, because they don't want tribes to reap the profits of their very own resources that are on their land. Let alone do they want developing nations or nations in the South to reap the profits from materials such as lithium, the new green energy frontier. That's what capitalism is. That's fundamentally an unequal system. When we think about it beyond just the scope of the nation of the United States, but think about it in a global context, the things that we use, our iPhones, our clothes, et cetera, have to be produced by a cheap wage labor source that would never be profitable if they were employed in the United States. So they employ brown women typically in places like Bangladesh. And so capitalism is not the solution. It's the problem. Capitalism actually, we need to go beyond capitalism, but how we get there is another question. You can't wake up tomorrow, have good intentions, and then go and hug the murder out of capitalism. That's not going to happen. We have to move through this system. And we have to organize on all fronts. We have a new growing labor militancy that's attacking one of the most destructive, carbon-intensive industries, which is the Amazon, the Amazon monopoly on logistics. We should support unionization efforts. We should support unionization efforts and workers' democracy, because unions aren't environmentally bad. They often are, pitted against environmentalists all the time, but there are examples, going back to when the Black Hills Alliance allied with gold miners and ranchers in our homelands, people who would be ideologically considered settlers and colonizers, to say that treaty rights not only protect Indigenous people and our access to the land, but they also protect workers who are working in, hazardous conditions, who drink water that their mine tailings are polluting, right? We all drink the same water. Like, Indigenous people aren't unique, and somehow water that enters our body is something like that that's different. And so thinking about that and scaling up the idea of the local to the universal, and thinking that Indigenous values protect everybody's, access to clean drinking water, access to air, access to land that we all need to survive. And so when we think about alternative systems, my tendency is towards socialism, but that requires organizing society to fight for something that's beneficial to everyone, not just our own interests as people who live in the United States, or not just our own interests even as Indigenous people, but to understand that we are living at a very important time period where the actions that we take right now are going to affect generations to come. And there are ethical actions we can take, and there are unethical actions that we can take. And I think the most ethical action that we can take is to really fight like hell to build something that's different. And whatever that looks like, we have to find out through struggle itself. And the only way we win is if we struggle. And we can't be afraid to do that in this moment.
I was reflecting on the last time I spoke at Bioneers in person, which was, I think, 2019. Was that the last in person? Yeah. It was also a panel like this on economies and capitalism, and the white guy that was on our panel said, "I can't imagine a world without capitalism," and I said, "Really?" Like, because I can, you know. And I think that's just because I have seen glimpses of our systems through my family and how they work, and through my communities and how they work. When you are involved in Indigenous communities, you see a very different way of living. And it's just, like I said, we don't have the terminologies for it yet. We don't, we, meaning like, this particular society we're in, we don't want to elevate Indigenous ways of being, again, because it's in complete opposition to what capitalism is. So yeah, I can't imagine a world without capitalism, and it is going to be a struggle to get there. And I'm thinking about right now friends of mine, Jessica Bresnicek and Ruby Montoya, who are facing years in prison. Jessica's in for 8 years right now, and Ruby will be in at some point, but she has a new defense. And they're in there for eco-terrorism, for terrorism, for going after, public infrastructure projects, for burning some machinery. And that's the struggle that they were willing to take on. There's more, there's more. There's things that we do when the feds come in, and they come and knock on our door. And that's very scary. But what if everybody was doing something where, the feds had to come knock on your door? And it's not for anything illegal. You're not doing anything illegal. You're just out there surveying a pipeline being installed, or, protesting, and they just want to come and basically scare you, right? But if we understood that that's just how it's going to be, I think we'd be a little further ahead in dismantling capitalism. I think about the human rights movement, the Red Power movement, civil rights movement, the Red Power movement back in the day, and why was it, kind of successful? Like, why did something happen then that was quite profound? And it was because people were everywhere. People were out in the streets everywhere. It wasn't just one spot where one thing was happening. Like Standing Rock was profound, right? But it was in one spot. This was a whole entire country, and even, other countries also standing up at the same time. And we need more of that. And those are not easy things to do. We've gotten to a point where we're very, fat and happy. The majority of, colonizer descendants, they don't feel a need to make change because they're fine. And there's a lot of propaganda which leads them to think that they're fine. And that's given rise to the very scary state of fascism that we're in right now. Again, it's always been here, but now it's definitely here. And we need to stand up to those things. But there's a lot of fear instilled in our society concerning, doing those kinds of things. I mean, the only way you're going to take down capitalism is by taking it down. Like, you have to boycott, you have to boycott capitalism. I don't know the answer to that. I don't know exactly how you do it, but I'm thinking about what's the Spanish word for a horn of plenty?
Like cornucopia?
Kind of like that, but there's a.
Does anyone out there know that word?
There's a really cool organization,
No?
and they've
Okay.
been planning a massive strike for immigrants now for many, many, many years, where they want to have millions of people strike, but they're building safe houses. They're, saving, they're getting all their resources together, because if you strike, you still need to eat, right? But this amazing organization has been doing this for a very long time, and I want to see them do it. I want to see them strike like that, and I want this current economy, this current these current colonizer descendants to see like what it's like to live without these folks that rightfully belong here. So it takes things like that. It takes a real struggle. It takes giving up a lot as well. It means being scared at times too, and that's just my thought. Moving forward. I mean, again, I feel like this abortion issue is a very succinct example of like what we're dealing with, and what's that going to take if they actually go through with this decision? What's going to happen? What are we going to have to do? People are going to have to make some very, very serious decisions about how they're living, and if they really want to make change, what are they willing to give up?
Thank you. I'm so glad that you ended your statement on that note, because that's literally what I wanted to talk about. When I think about the answer to this question and what we can do, and listening to your responses, I thought it really made me think about the overturning of Roe v. Wade, because there are many reasons that women want reproductive control over their bodies and they want to terminate a pregnancy, but one of the ones is because of fear. A fear of not finishing your education, fear of never getting married, fear of not being able to get a job, fear of being a poor single mom. And really, if you think about it in that way, why does that fear exist? Because we have such rampant inequality. And what communities fear that the most? Communities that have no extended kin network. Communities, people who are descended from Africa, people whose ancestors were brought over and enslaved, where their systems have been so disrupted. Also, even I think about poor white people descended from immigrants. They have been taught this chock of lies about the fake-ass American dream, that if you work hard enough, you'll make it. And so these fools keep voting for these people who put in laws that make inequality more rampant and bring taxes down for the wealthy and continue the system that they're suffering from. It's so obvious to us who can see it. And so then they have these broken up families and they can't afford to just have kids and be able to keep, the choice is children, healthcare, food, and keeping a roof over your head. What do you want? And so I want to end on this note about what can we learn from Indigenous understandings of wealth and economies to lead us towards a more regenerative future. And I was recently at an event where we did a spitball session cross-culturally about what does wealth mean to you? And there were a lot of Native folks in the room. And when posed that question, they said things, I was trying to remember what they said and jot it down. They said things like community, my grandma, fish, knowing my language, knowing my songs, living on the land. That is our definitions of wealth. It's not money in the bank. And bringing it back around to this Roe v. Wade issue, I have several friends who are my age who probably from like their early to mid 40s and younger, all the way down to 35, have already become grandmothers. And I remember being kind of jealous of them because we're the same age and I always chased that rat race and I could never dare get pregnant until I'd gone to college, bought a house, got a PhD, got a job, switched my job 5 times. Okay, now I'm stable. Now I can have a kid and I'm old. And my friends are starting to become grandmothers. And the reason they could do it, which I observed, is that they lived in these Native communities with extended kinship networks and a lot of traditional economies still at play, albeit alongside the dominant economy. And there was never a fear. If you were 16 and you had a baby, I've always thought it to be very moralizing to say teenagers can't have babies, because I've seen it done very well many times in Native communities. And the family stepped in and they helped, and they got to grow up, and they got to hang out with their friends, and everybody, everybody pitched in, and that's a beautiful thing, I think. So we really need to think about, how all of this relates to dismantling these ideologies that force us to think certain ways when really that's not how things have to go at all. So we have just about 20 minutes for questions, which is great. I believe we have 2 mics set up on either side. And I see some people who have been in my panels before, so you know the drill if you've been in my panels. I'm very militant about it, and I will give you the stink eye if you don't literally ask a question. And the reason is we want to get to as many of your questions as possible. And we always get a lot of great questions here. So if you say a statement that ends in a period, you will get the stink eye. Somebody else from down there will come up to you and tell you to stop. I can't because I'm on stage. But just ask a question, and we'll be happy to answer it. If you want to talk about something that you're doing in your life or some kind of case study, wait until afterwards, and we'll be more than happy to talk to you about your particular situation. But yeah, so yesterday I started on this side. Oh, Michael says start here? Okay. Okay, let's start with you first.
Well, thank you. I've given a lot of thought on my own to what's the nature of an economy that works for everyone and for all life. And one of the distinctions that I came across in doing my thinking is that what we call capitalism is distinct from what I would call for-profit commerce. Now, for-profit commerce might be your fishery and taking care of the fish. Is that the sockeye? Whereas capitalism is distinctly and only about the capital. It's about investor capital. And does that kind of distinction seem like a valid and useful distinction in this conversation that you're having here?
That's for you.
You want me to take that? Let the wheels turn for a second. I mean, it could be, if you look at the definition of capitalism that I gave earlier in this talk, the exploitation of paid labor, privatization, and accumulation, and technology to create more. Yes, I do. In short, yes, I think it is a useful distinction, and perhaps like this example of maybe a tribe or a community investing in a solar power project or a new fishery or something like that, where the money circulates locally and it's based in native values. That's what I call indigenous capitalism. Sikowis might not like it, but but we all have different opinions. That's why I brought this group of 3 of us together.
That's what we have.
Yeah.
So yes, I think it's useful.
In other words, making a profit isn't inherently evil. It's what the profit is, what you're really up to.
I wanted to add to that.
Yeah.
You know, I wrote this, you reminded me of this little meme I made, a while ago. I said, colonial capitalism is officially a culture of perpetual discontent. So, capitalism in and of itself, and colonizers are forever trying to reach a state of pure hegemony. Did I say that right? I'm so bad with that word.
Hegemony.
Hegemony. Thank you. And so, like that would be, to me, be the difference between like what capitalism is and what like the type of commerce you're discussing.
Yeah, but I don't think that, and thank you, we'll move to the next person after this, but I want to respond. I don't think making a profit is bad in and of itself at all. In fact, My Native Corporation, which I said is doing really well, they're investing those profits back in all the things that the government should actually do, like you said, like healthcare, education, scholarships, technical and vocational education, elder funds, language classes, everything that, culture camps, all of those things. And then also those profits are redistributed to shareholders. We have shareholders in our Alaska Native corporations, and they made a special elders fund. And I know for sure my mom and a lot of elders I know really appreciate that. And you cannot do that without profit. So I would disagree with the last point. But I really appreciate your question, and we'll move on to the next one over here.
Thank you. I'm grateful to hear wisdom that I haven't heard, that there are other possibilities. This month, Governor Newsom here in California is entertaining opposition to his plan to invest $12 billion in lithium mining 2 miles below the Salton Sea in order to electrify everything. And Nick, you expressed the dangers of that and the dangers of not using less and going forward with a way we can use more. What arguments might we use with our governor?
I'm sorry, I don't know, I'm not really familiar with the exact situation. So is he planning to open a lithium mine? Is that the goal?
Brand new extensive lithium mining in order to electrify, build batteries and store electric to electrify and everything. It's better than coal, but
yeah. I think in this moment in time, we are going to see a transition. It's going to happen, and I think there are corporations and companies out there that know that they can make a profit from this. They have diversified their investments. Even a lot of the fossil fuel industry has done this. The problem with it, in my opinion, is not so much whether or not you should. Yeah, the question of the lithium mine is problematic, but it's also for who though? Who does this benefit? And oftentimes the people who should be being held accountable for getting us into this mess in the first place are going to walk scot-free without facing any repercussions. A lot of people might disagree with me on this point, but I would say that one of the first steps in addressing the fossil fuel industry here in the United States would be to nationalize it, to take the resources and put it into the hands of people versus CEOs and corporate boards, and see how we can break up these fossil fuel monopolies and these energy monopolies, because that's really what we're talking about. Energy isn't inherently bad. And obviously there's going to be questions about what level of exploitation will you allow to maintain a dignified life, right? Because we can't just say, hey, we're going to stop taking showers tomorrow, we're going to turn all of our phones off. That's not going to happen. There's got to be a way that you're providing needs for people, and the priority isn't just these energy monopolies that are essentially sucking up these things. And I'm not really sure about this project in the Salton Sea, but I do know that there are other projects that for these what they're calling strategic minerals, such as lithium and copper and cobalt, are kind of targeting already vulnerable populations and peoples and geographies. Environmental racism is a thing. It didn't just go away because the energy or the materials they're mining are for green energy. The relationship is maintaining is the same. So I think we need a fundamentally different kind of reality where it's people who are making those decisions in a democratic way versus the state being the handmaiden of capital and big business, because that's really what's happening. I mean, you can see it with the electric companies here. It's horrific. Why aren't they in, I'm an abolitionist, but, so this is just a turn of phrase, but why aren't they in prison? Why is it that my family is criminalized for wanting a better life or being forced to make decisions about one's body because it's illegal, because they're economic, right? they're the real criminals. And I think that's really the mentality that we need. I mean, we have to be, people kind of shy away from this word, but we should be militant and unapologetic about that this is where the fault lies. Sure, if you don't believe in spreading out and redistributing these resources and power, well, you never let us have the chance, so let us fail doing it. But until then, shut up.
This is critical energy theory. Thank you.
Yep.
Okay, we're going to go back to this side.
Hi there. My question is, can any of you cite an example of a very successful partnership enterprise that is a public-private or a funding situation that you feel is a good model and that's gone very well in any of the nations in collaboration with a funder?
What would make for a successful partnership
That
is
would
what
be
we could
definition
answer.
of
Yeah.
How about
success.
that? Okay.
And after the panel yesterday, I was curious about, the question for me arises after all these panels.
So what would make for a good partnership would be, first, taking the time to really develop a relationship. So for example, sometimes when you're on these calls, like for funding and even philanthropy, and the program officer or the potential funder is like, I got a half an hour window, go to my Calendly. Don't do that with Native folks. That's like, I had a great call with somebody that's going to be partnering on a project, and that person started out with, they really basically did an Indigenous type of get to know you. We always try and figure out how we're related first, and where do you come from, and who do you know, and tell some stories about how you grew up, and start with anything but what you do for your job first. So when I teach allyship and institutional decolonization courses, one of the first things I do is have people introduce themselves by where they're from, what land are they related to, and something they feel a kinship with. And even in the same office, or there were people who work together maybe for 10 years, they learn things about each other and they're shocked about how much more in common they have, and it builds the rapport. So any partnership, step one has got to start with building a rapport in a way that's different than the status quo. That's one thing. Also, being with the decolonizing legal instruments is a really good way. I do know one or two lawyers that are really working in that space to address the MOUs and agreements and roles and responsibilities in ways that are more, I guess, cross-culturally equitable and take into account Indigenous values and don't just subsume them by the dominant ways things are done. I think I'll just stop with those two tips. Those are two good starting points for developing good partnerships.
Thank you.
I
We'll
was just
find you.
thinking about how we were denied a grant just last week, a rather large one, so it was upsetting. And they were so happy with our community engagement and with how we work within our communities, how we uplift our communities, how we are from our communities, and they gave us very high marks for that. And where we got lower marks was in our process of, this is a climate grant, by the way, our process of our climate work. And basically, we radically attack capitalism a lot in everything we do, in our big ag work, in our CO2 pipeline work, in our Mead, Nebraska work, no matter what it is we're doing, railing against the overall institution causing this issue was always front and center. And yet, no other organization is doing that in Iowa, right? But maybe because we're not testing water or doing something that would be considered, climate and environment-y, we're just not getting the type of attention, or we're not getting noticed for that reason. But yet we are getting at the fundamental issue, and I think that is also a problem. I think a lot of funders don't want to talk about the fundamental issue of Christian colonial capitalism.
Thank you. Well, I'm very sorry to you over there. We're not going to be able to get to you. And we're actually almost out of time here. And I do want us to each have a 30-second, 1-minute closeout statement, whatever you want to say. We will have time for your question, but whoever of us answers it needs to answer it in like 2 minutes or less. Are we cool with that? Fit in one more question? Okay.
Thank you to each and every one of you so much for, I think, just being here and providing so much information and wisdom. And one of the things that I've heard about the indigenous economies and trying to support that and the methodologies of supporting that and the inherent wisdom in those ways of life that are embedded in those economies, which I completely agree with, and completely agree with the need for reparations for what was fundamentally war crimes and perpetrations that need to be repaid, with interest for the time that's gone on. And Nick, I actually want to thank you for saying something that I haven't heard in as many of these dialogues, is that, I came here on an airplane. A lot of people came here in
Not
cars.
a question.
Do you believe
Thank you.
that there is a potential to have some kind of a capitalist economy or something like that, whatever the new phraseology may be, where we eradicate the blatant consumerist and exploitative mind frame, that idea of decolonizing the mind where it's not so blatant, and it sounds like maybe, you believe in public ownership of the goods, which, again, not to classify things as more like communism, but do you think there's some kind of a way forward inside of capitalism, or that's fundamentally impossible?
I guess that's directed at me. So I'll
Or
be really,
whomever, but
yeah, I'll be really brief. And I would say that you can't, like I said, it's not like even in all the revolutions that have tried to move away from capitalism, it's never been an overnight process. I would say that socialism is a transitory phase where there is still forms of private capital. And there, like the question that was earlier, that was proposed earlier, it's like, yeah, you do use surplus and allocate it towards, redistribution, towards certain things, sometimes reinvestment. But I think the tendency is to say that, like, what we are living under right now is completely unsustainable. And so trying to, make it more ethical is impossible. I'm not interested in reforming it. Some people may be, but I'm not. And I would say but that doesn't mean that tomorrow, we just wake up and it's like, this can be totally different. There has to be some kind of transition where there will be those questions being entertained. So that's my short answer to that. But thanks.
Well, I will start first, and we'll just go down the line with the final thing we have to say. I think I'm really happy to see all of you here today, and it means that you care, and these are issues that you care about, and I would encourage each and every one of you to continue to educate yourself on this topic. If it's something that is really exciting to you, if we have surveys in the audience we can take, let us know if you want more. And I would just like to end on the note, it makes my heart really happy to see all of you caring about what we're talking about. And I guess I would leave you with this final thought, which is that really, really listen to us with your ears, with your heart, and even with this question around making partnerships, or the last great question that we got, it really has to do with listening and ruminating on the topic and really trying to free your mind from assumptions that have been drilled into you your whole life if you're non-native, because we, or at least non-bicultural, I say, because we have an advantage as native folks, like W.E.B. Du Bois's double consciousness. We have to learn how to be successful or try and exist or even survival mode, like Nick said earlier. But we have to really learn how to work in this system that isn't made for us, but we also know our own systems, so we can code switch between them really easily. And if you've only grown up in the one system, my call to you is to listen so you can start learning how to code switch and open up your mind to these new solutions and these ways of transitioning out of this while we're still in it.
So somebody once told me that this system will only collapse when people begin to die in mass numbers. And this pandemic has killed over 1 million Americans and has plunged a lot of communities into crisis. And my question is, like, why didn't anything change because of that? We don't have socialized healthcare. We're not even close to that. We don't even, there's an actual more disregard and antipathy towards minorities and other people, right, that don't fit within dominant society. But even in those crises, there were Indigenous people, tribal communities offering vaccines, maintaining this kind of mode of relations, not just with ourselves. It wasn't just like us versus the world. It was us versus, this disease. And I think it had a potential to unify us, but it didn't, and millions died. And it's a huge tragedy. It's a huge loss in Indigenous communities. We've lost a lot of knowledge and elders. But at the same time, when we're talking about a future without capitalism, it's important to understand that many people can't even think about today without trying to find out where their food is, where their water is, and to understand that the things that we're talking about in many circumstances in our communities are life and death situations. But I do think that there's hope and possibility in this moment, more so than there were even in 2016 when Standing Rock was going on. And so I just want to thank you all for entertaining a lot of these ideas, but also to just get involved and find us online and support our organizations.
I'm thinking about the Republican Party right now and how it's synonymous, in my opinion, right now, with just pure evil and absolute capitalism. And not that the Democratic Party is any better, because none of these parties have ever done us any favors as Indigenous people, but that this particular party is something we really need to understand better and we need to dismantle, because it is a very small fraction of this country that is running everything. And it's because they are united, and there's a lot of solidarity going on there on the right, on the fundamentalist, crazy Christian right, and what's happening on the other side of that? There's a lot of factions. There's not a lot of solidarity. One of the biggest things that Great Plains Action Society does is work on solidarity. We work with, our Black brothers and sisters, our Latino and Latina brothers and sisters throughout the state of Iowa. I'm very proud to say that we just hosted a climate summit, and we brought 100 grassroots organizers, to come and learn about what's going on there. So like my statement is, we need to end the white Christian problem, by working together. And by white, I don't mean like white people. I'm talking about white supremacy. That is like the absolute elephant in the room a lot of the times, along with Christianity. And that is invasive in all of our spaces. We also need to tell the truth. We have these shirts on. They say the truth will not be whitewashed. And that's another issue we need to overcome very greatly, is whitewashing the truth. We have bans all over the country right now in 18 states on critical race theory. That's why we made these shirts. If you want one, you can grab one at Humanize My Hoodie or go to Great Plains Action and get one from there. But like, it's like this, we're living a lie. And capitalism is a wonderful has a wonderful propaganda machine, which is the government itself pushing it forward. So that's a really big statement to make, but we need to take these. We need to fundamentally change these systems from the ground up.
Thank you so much for joining us today, and give a hand to my awesome friends and colleagues, and give a hand to yourselves as well.